And today we're going to start talking about the Jewish people, and we'll stay with the Jewish people. But before we get to the Jewish people, just want to show you the transition how the Torah made the transition from talking about the big picture, the universal cosmological description of the first 11 chapters of Genesis, into this one family that later on will be known as the Jewish people. So last week we talked briefly, we ended more or less with the story of Noah. Noah was in a way a second creation, because God looked at the original creation from chapters 1 and 2, and even though God was happy with what God has created in the beginning, it seems like things did not work out for him. I say him again for God because it's easier, and sometimes it just slips. So I'll mention it today too, that God is not a male or a female, but just easier. God gave us human beings free will, and it seems like we did the wrong thing. We misused the free will, and many generations, or 10 generations after Adam, the whole earth was corrupt. And the way for corruption in the Bible, one of the words for corruption in the Bible is Hamas, no different than the terrorist organization in Gaza Strip, because Hebrew and Arabic are quite close. So Hamas is this violence and hatred among people and unspeakable act. And God decided to wipe out the entire creation, only that after God wiped them out, God had second thoughts, promised us. This is the first covenant that God is having with human beings.
On the video, so I don't want to put it on.
Promised human being not to bring something like the flood again, never again to destroy the world. And for that, God expected us to follow a small list of principles, of commandments, only 7, and all of us would agree about them. It's do not steal, do not murder, and etc. Some time later, Noah had 3 sons. That's important to mention in our context. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Yefet. Okay, wow. The Shem is important. That's the Sem or Semite. Okay, so we are Semites. So the people of the Middle East, of the Levant, we call them in different ways, are the Semites. Okay, I'm not going to talk about anti-Semitism, if it's right or wrong, because some people, I will mention for a second, because some people say, when you say anti-Semitism, you also include anti-Muslim, because the Muslims or the Arabs are as Semites as we are. But anti-Semitism, at least for many, many years, is directed only at Jews. But that's just in parentheses, since we are having a class. And so people lived on Earth, and the transition between the prehistory or the global history is the story of the Tower of Babel in the 11th chapter of Genesis. I'll just remind you quickly about this story. All the people of the earth decided to concentrate in one place, in one city. It was already an act against God's wishes for us, because God told us that we should procreate, we should have as many children as possible, and spread all over the world. Okay, we remember the procreation from that, but also to spread all over, to settle different parts of the world that God has created. What did the people in this story do? Exactly the opposite. They're all concentrated in one place. Many scholars believe that this is part of the polemics of the criticism of big cities. Okay, it's something that I mentioned and I will mention it again. And it seems like Bible did not appreciate the big cities in that case, like if you want it in Egypt and in this case in Mesopotamia. And the people of these big cities realize how powerful and wise they are. So they decided to build a tower that reaches up to heaven. And this tower in that location still exists today. I do not believe that any of you is planning soon to take a trip to Iraq, and not only because of the pandemic, but because of some other good reasons. But this is the Ziggurat. It's a pyramid shape. You can look it up later if you want. It's the first pyramid. It's not as sophisticated as the Egyptian because it has been built before, but it's a very tall pyramid-shaped structure. That specific one is the Ziggurat for Marduk. Remember Marduk from the stories that we read, who was the main god of Babylon. God did not like it because he said, these people are getting too close to me. These people are getting too powerful. And therefore, God decided to mix up their languages, because they're all concentrated in one place and spoke the same language. When God mixed up the languages, they were not able to communicate. When you cannot communicate, you start fighting and you start spreading around. You start going to other places. The word that I have used a lot and will continue to use is etiology or etiological explanation. And in this story, we have many. For example, etiology is when we explain how things became the way they are. So if we ask the question, how come people use different languages? Because when God created us, we all spoke the same language, right? We look at the story of the Tower of Babel and said, yeah, in the beginning, it's true. Everyone spoke the same language, but because of their tower, because they became so arrogant and even saw themselves as competition to God, God mixed up their languages, and that's why we all speak different languages. Why this city is called Babel? Babel in Akkadian, which was the language that they spoke in Babel in Mesopotamia, means gate for God, but the Bible gives it a different explanation, which it often does, and it's really nice. And Babel is confusion in Hebrew, and also in English. Sometimes when somebody just talks and without making a sense, you say, oh, they babble, right? It's bubble. And so why Babel? Because God confused their languages. So we have, or when people ask, what's this thing that they know about the Ziggurat? These are the generation after Noah, and that's what they built. God was not pleased with them, and God, who keeps changing, keeps adapting to the reality, because God gave us free will, and we always surprise God. We do not behave according to what God had planned for us or wished that we would do. So God realized, I cannot deal with the entire universe. Let me at least start small. Let me find a small group of people, in this case, even two. And with them, through them, I will try to understand human beings much better, and they will be my partners. They will help me to run the world in a better place. And here begins the story of the Jewish people. I want us to look at the text, but before we look at the text, a word about portions, right? Every Shabbat we have a different Torah portion, which means a different part of the Torah that we read. There are 54 Torah portions. I know that there are less than 54 weeks during the year, but we have the leap year and we have different things. Sometimes the Torah portions create a gap of knowledge or gap of understanding for us. And this would be a very good example, because for some reason, the Torah portion that begins the story, that it's called Lech Lecha, that is supposed to start the story of Abraham, does not start from the beginning. So when we talk about Abraham, when we talk about this portion, we always say that God appeared to Abraham and said, Lech Lecha, go forth, leave your place in Mesopotamia and go to the place that I will show you. But the truth is that the story of Abraham begins on chapter 11 at the end. And I want us to read it. Okay? And Patrick, I see you here. You asked me a question, what translation I use. For this class, I just use the New American Version or New International Version. All of them are good for that. When or if or we'll have a class that focuses closely on the text, I would probably use the newest Jewish translation we have by Robert Alter. I wanted to give you the answer when because other people asked me to. But when you look at the New American Version or they're really good for our purpose. They read very well. They make sense in Hebrew, not the content always, yeah, but definitely the language.
Yeah, no, so the newest one by Alter, right, that just came out like last year is the one you're talking about, as opposed to the 1985 one, right?
The 1995, yeah, that's the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society. It's perfectly good, but Alter is quite phenomenal. It's expensive. It costs some $100 or so, and that's not something that everyone wants to invest in. Just I wanted to give you and anyone else who is interested the answer about translation. So let's look at this story of the Jewish people. I'll say the second but in the last time, there were no Jews during the time of Abraham. Okay, this is an anachronism because Jews are the descendants of Judah, who was the great grandson of Abraham. Why do I say Jews? Because we're talking about the Jewish people, but if I were in an academic setting, I wouldn't have uttered the word Jews. Okay, I would have said the Israelites, but sometimes it's too long and too boring to talk about the Israelites. And I want to make the connection because it's important between us today, 2021, and Abraham and Isaac. So it's but the right way is to say Israelites, and you need to forgive me using the term Jews, the anachronistic term Jews. So let's see how it works. Wrong, sorry. Share a screen and Genesis. Okay. Let me make it even bigger. Do you see the text that says Genesis 11 to 20? Yes. Yes, do you see it clearly?
Yes.
Okay, good. If you don't, just let me know. Yeah, we try to use Zoom in the best way and the most accessible way. So I can actually see you too. That's really nice. So let's start. This is the account of Terah's family line. Terah became the father of Abram or Abram. Okay, he will later on become Abraham. God likes to change the names of some of the main characters, but he started as Abram without the H, or in Hebrew without the He. Okay, so Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran, 3 sons. And Haran became the father of Lot. It's confusing, but I'll highlight the important thing. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans in the land of his birth. So Abraham lost a brother, okay? Abraham and Nahor both married. the name of Abram's wife was Sarai. Later on, she will become Sarah or Sarah. But at this point, Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, father of Milcah. You have to get used to this begetting and Iscah. And this is the key verse to understand the narrative. Now Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. You read a lot justified feminist interpretations that get really mad at the text because what kind of a way it is to describe a woman only by ability or a disability to bear children. Put that aside, at least for now, and look at it as a literary device really to make us understand how the narrative flows, because this is very, very important. So Abraham's wife, Sarah or Sarai, was not able to give birth, and that's, by the way, would be the case with most of the matriarchs. Rebecca will have problems and Rachel will have problems. The only one who was fertile was Leah. Okay, so that was a current theme. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years and he died in Haran. I know it's confusing, and let me just repeat. Oh, let me ask you actually, who started the journey?
I'm confused because I thought that Abram left his dad, Terah,
And that's
Chaldea in the
thank
Ur.
you. And that's what my little introduction in the beginning, when I said we are confused because of the division to Torah portions. Because the portion about Abraham starts with, and God said to Abraham, go forth of your land, of your father's place, of your birthplace, and go to the place that I will show you, okay? That's what we normally read, and almost nobody reads this part of the end of chapter 11, because before that we have some very boring list of unimportant names, or at least for us. Okay, so even if you read it, you don't pay any attention to it, and you go to chapter 12. But I wanted to show it because it's very, very important that the story of Abraham begins before. And that's why people don't pay attention to the key words that creates the tension of the story later on, that it was that Sarah was barren, she was not able to give birth. So the one who really started the journey from Ur, which is in Mesopotamia, to Canaan was Abraham's father. And why he did it? Very likely because he was in mourning. It was the worst thing that can happen, I believe, to people, is losing a child, and he lost a child. Okay? And sometimes when we have to deal with a major trauma, a way to do it is just, I want to get out of where I am. I just cannot rebuild my life in that place. I need a change. The Torah does not tell us why he left, but the juxtaposition between the information about the death of the son and Haran takes everyone, Terah takes everyone out of Mesopotamia to move somewhere else, makes a lot of sense. Now, you change your place, there is an expression in Hebrew, I don't know if it exists in English, that change a place, you change your luck. Is there an equivalent in English? I never heard it, I don't know. But in Hebrew, it's a very common thing that people say all the time. change your place, your location, you change your luck. And maybe that was the idea here. But they didn't make it to the land of Canaan. It seems like they got stuck in the middle, right? In a place that they named after their dead son, Haran. And they got stuck, and then begins the famous chapter 12, when God tells Abraham, go forth. It was not so much go forth from Mesopotamia, but from this place where you got stuck, and complete the journey. Go to the place that I will show you. And that, but God does not end there. God does not just tell Abraham to leave. God promises Abraham several things. He said to him that God would provide him with three major things. One is children, a lot. God would use the images of the number of stars in the sky and the number of grain of sand in the desert to illustrate the number of descendants that Abram will have. So one thing is children, he will become a big nation. The other thing that God promises Abraham is a blessing. God tells him that God will bless him, and everyone, excuse my coffee maker, who always, for some reason, chooses to clean itself during the class. So God will bless him and all the people who are his friends, and God will curse his enemies. And God promises him the third thing, the land. Okay, so you will get the land, you will become a nation, and you will get the blessing. So this is the beginning of our story. Now, the challenge for you, if you can, and I don't know how really you can do it, is to try to forget. When you go back and read the stories now, try to forget everything that you know. If you can do that, you will appreciate the story much more. Because now we, the readers, when we read about Abraham and Sarah, all we know is that Sarah cannot have children, and at the same time, God promised Abraham that he will have many children, that he will turn into a people, into a nation. And that creates a lot of tension because Abraham, until much later in the story, has no clue. He didn't get the idea that his children have to be also Sarah's children. And for him, God said, children, I'll take children from wherever they come, okay? So as he arrived, I'll give you a few examples from the Torah. As Abraham and Sarah arrived in the land of Canaan, first thing they encounter is famine. There is no rain, there is no food in Canaan. The only place that had food is Egypt, which is historically accurate and an ongoing repeating theme in the Bible. Egypt always had food. And why is that? Because of the Nile. Egypt is flat, and even during bad years that without a lot of rain, people were always able to trench tunnels or channels to irrigate their fields. In a place like Canaan, and those of you who have been to Israel, it's a very hilly place. And when you have your fields on the hill, without rain, you cannot do much, okay? So no rain, you're in trouble, you're hungry, you go to Egypt. That always had some. So Abraham and Sarah did not have food in Canaan, so they moved to Egypt. Like many years later, 4 generations later, that's what their descendants will be doing. There was only one problem in Egypt. The Pharaoh liked beautiful women. And people who entered Egypt with single or unmarried women would, or there was a chance that they would be taken to the Pharaoh's harem. Sarah was beautiful, and Abraham told her, now we're going there. If you'll say that you're married to me, they may kill me, because that's one way to make a woman single, getting rid of her husband. They do have their ethics, so they would not take a married woman, but if she happened to be unmarried, they would take her. So he told her, just say that you're my sister. And if you're my sister, not only that they will not harm me, Abraham, they will give me a lot of money for you. Because women at that time belonged to their fathers, and if there was no father, they belonged to their brothers, the older brother who became the patriarch, okay? And that's exactly what happened. But we read the story and said, what? I mean, he's the father of our nation. He was pimping out his wife. I mean, that's not something that we feel comfortable. And besides, God said that Sarah will be the mother of the child, but Abraham did not know that. So he didn't care if she will spend the night or many nights with the Pharaoh, or because for him, I'll somehow get a son. He did not get the idea that Sarah must be the mother. So this is the first incident that we have. But when we understand that Abraham did not know that Sarah must be the mother of his child that will start the whole dynasty, the whole nation, we say, okay, so that's what he did, but it still had nothing to do with God's promise. Another time, Abraham considered to adopt his nephew Lot, whom we saw in the short passage that we read, as his son. And that something was quite common back then. Perhaps even today, adoption is not rare, but if at one point in your life you don't have children and you realize that you're not going to, or if you choose, you can adopt someone and make that person your heir. So in that case, it was Lot, his nephew. And at a different time, we see that Abraham entertained the idea of adopting his servant, Eliezer, to be his heir. And when we miss the point that he did not know that it must be Sarah's son, we don't understand why Lot, what was going on with Abraham. He really did not get it until God spelled it out to him in chapter 17. More than that, just to make the tension even greater, when Sarah realized that she was not able, no matter what, to have children, she followed something that was common in biblical time, a practice in which she gave her husband her maid to be the mother of a child, and Sarah was planning to become the surrogate mother of the child of her maid. Let me just repeat it again. So Abraham would spend the night with Sarah's maid, with Hagar, have a child, as happened, Ishmael. But Ishmael would be the surrogate son of Sarah. If you don't know that Sarah had to be the mother, okay, so now Abraham was perfectly happy. I have a baby. God fulfilled this promise to me, right? The problem was that Hagar, after she gave birth, started to disrespect her mistress, Sarah. And Sarah went to Abraham and said, it's either she or me, because she's not staying here. She's a maid. I'm your wife. And Abraham did not know what to do. He had a son. He believed that God fulfilled God's promise through this son. And now she said, get rid of this maid and her son. So Abraham asked God what to do. And God said, get rid of them, do as your wife tells you. So if you read it for the first time again, you say, okay, so now we have Abraham again, now already around 90 years old without a son. How is God going to fulfill the promise that he gave Abraham? And we're not even talking about the land and the other thing. So Abraham gets rid of them, and then the angels or the messengers come in chapter 17 and say to Abraham and Sarah, you are going to have a son. And Abraham says to God, to the messenger, I don't need it. I have a son. And besides, I'm almost 100 now, and my wife is almost 90, way beyond her childbearing age. And God said, you really misunderstood me for 5 chapters. I promised you and Sarah together a son. It's not only to you, Abraham. Okay, and we have a son, Isaac. So far, so good. Any comments, any questions, anything anyone wants to say? Nothing. Okay. Let me just look for 1 second here to see that I did not. Yeah, there is, before I move to the next part of the story, in the very first class, somebody asked me, maybe David, maybe somebody else, something about the historicity of the story. Did Abraham really live? Was he a historical figure? And I said we cannot really prove that he was, but I want to use this opportunity to talk about some of the modern scholarship that deals with the issue. Because we have one group of scholars who say, yes, of course, things did not happen exactly the way they are described, or even if they did, there's no way to prove it. But the story of our ancestors, of our matriarchs and patriarchs, must have been based on some reality. And I'll just give you a few examples how they prove their point. They say that Abraham is constantly described as a foreigner in the land of Canaan. So if later generations wrote it or made it up, and they constantly, as it is also in 2021, try to make the point that they are the owners of the land, it wouldn't make any sense to say that our ancestors were foreigners in the land. You actually want to say, my ancestors have been here forever. Did I make my point clear? So why saying that I'm a newcomer if I want to say that this land belongs to me? When you follow the discussion or the debate between the Israelis and the Palestinians, that's exactly what you hear. The Palestinians say correctly, we've been here for thousands of years, and you guys just came in the early 1900s and took over the place, but we've been here forever, which is a valid argument, right? They wouldn't come and say, we just arrived here and we claim ownership of the land. So some scholars say, no, if it has been written later on, they wouldn't have emphasized the fact that Abraham and the rest of the family came from Mesopotamia. They would have said, we are the indigenous people to the land. Other thing is that when the Torah describes the patriarchs and matriarchs, there are many unflattering things that they say about them. When we talk about our parents, for example, unless everyone knows the facts, we're not going to make up bad things about them. Okay? So when we read many bad things about them, said, that's not a normal thing unless there was already an oral tradition about them, maybe even some written tradition that was known. And that's why the Bible had to include it. But you're not going to include negative things unless it's already there. Okay? Another thing already also related to the Arameans, we keep emphasizing that we're descendants of the Arameans, of the Mesopotamians. But later on, during the time of the kingdom, from 1000 on, BC on, they were our enemy. So why do you want to attach yourself to your enemy, to say that they are your ancestors, unless it was well known, or unless it has been already written, or at least transmitted orally? So what these scholars say is that it's not exactly that Abraham definitely was alive and was married to Sarah the way it's described, but the people who wrote the stories had much older material upon which they based their arguments. Because if they had made up everything, they would have written the story differently. Okay, which makes a lot of sense. Others say, not really. And that's really the school that is very dominant, mainly in Europe and mainly in Scandinavia. Said it's all written much later, and they made up the story. Just for you to be aware of that. I personally strongly believe that the way to read the Bible is never as a history book, because the Bible never claimed to be a history book. There are facts in the Bible that are based on historical facts, right? Because we read about Pharaoh Shishak, for example, during the times of Solomon, and we know Shishak lived, and we have many extra biblical texts that deal with Shishak, okay? But the Bible never meant to be a history book. The Bible tells us of some events, emphasizing the finger of God in these events. So how God shaped the reality. But not just to tell us the way that we would write history today, but even today when you write history, we know how subjective it is. Just think about the events that we witnessed 2 or 3 weeks ago in Washington, January 6th, and just try to imagine how it will be written even 5 years from now. Actually, it was written differently in different newspapers the night of the events, okay? So we all have our version of that event that took place weeks ago. Okay, so definitely the Bible was not meant to be read this way. Just the way you wouldn't read Shakespeare, right? And Hamlet in Denmark and say, oh no, he's going to teach us about the history of the, no, we just know that's the backdrop against which the wonderful story was written. And that's the way we have to read the Bible. So yes, some facts are important, are historical, but that was never the intention. The Bible wanted to give us a more social, political, moral, existential a point of view, but definitely not, okay, that's exactly what happened and that's how you have to read it. And if that's what you choose, you miss all the beauty of the Bible and you get yourself into trouble, because then you say, oh, that thing definitely didn't happen, or definitely didn't happen this way, so let him take the Bible and throw it out of the window because it's all lies. Now, some people, actually many people, still fight very hard to argue that the Bible is accurate historically and scientifically, because they think that if they say no, it will create some faith problems to their people, right? But I think it's just we miss a major opportunity to appreciate the the real depth of the story of the Bible, the creation of these stories, the beautiful style. Before we continue with something else, I want to talk about the concept of a covenant. So I mentioned the covenant that between God and Noah, this universal covenant, no more floods. But then God is having on chapter 15 a special covenant with Abraham. Scholars quickly realized that the covenant between God and Abraham is modeled after the Caesarean style of the ancient world, not only in the ancient Near East. You had the Caesarean, you had the ruler, and you had the vassal, you had the subject. And it was very common for the suzerain to have the covenant. And by saying covenant, it's sort of a pact. In Hebrew, it's brit. Okay, that's a word that we use a lot. So you have a covenant between the suzerain and the subject, upon which the suzerain said, these are my obligations and these are your obligations. Now, always the covenant benefits the suzerain, right? Because I'm going to probably provide you with something, but you're going to give me taxes. You're going to be part of my army when I call you. You are going to send your daughters and wives to cook for me when I need. And there are beautiful descriptions when we read the story of Solomon of how he demanded the people to send him different labor and tons of money and taxes. Okay, but the covenant between God and Abraham is completely different. God is the suzerain, does not demand anything from Abraham. God only promises him things. And the setup just also works very well with the setup that we know from the past. The way it happened, God tells Abraham to take few animals, to cut them in the middle. And then God was walking in the middle between of the two parts of the carcass. Now that was, why was it so important? Because it symbolized what would happen to any side should they do not keep their side of the agreement. You're going to end up like this dead animal. But here God did not ask Abraham for anything. All he said, we're having this covenant. I'm obligated to provide you with progeny, the blessing, and the land. God is the owner of the land. And that's what God tells Abraham, and later on the prophets will say to the people of Israel to remind them. When God says to Abraham, that's really, really important thing to understand. I'm going to give you the land. God acts as a landlord. What he says is that right now he tells Abraham, not in this language, but I have tenants in the land, but I'm not happy with them. But the release is not up yet. But I really don't like what they do because they're not good. I'm going to make you the next tenant of the land. But you have to wait until the release is up. Okay, we have to understand this principle. It's really important. Because later on, the prophets, when they would talk to the people of Israel who were corrupt themselves and sinful and did horrible things, they remind them, you know, you take things for granted, but the land is not more yours than it was the land of the many other. And they give a list of the Perizzites and the Jebusites and the Canaanites and the Amalekites and the Ishmaelites and everyone else. You know, God keeps you in the land as long as you pay rent and you take good care of the land. Once you start playing games, you're out, just like all the previous tenants were out. Okay, and this is really, really important. And even the commentators, the traditional ones, when they ask the question, why didn't God start with the mitzvot, with the commandment, and started with the creation of the world? The answer is that God had to establish God's self as the owner of the land. So when God decided that Israel will be in the land of Canaan, they're in the land of Canaan. When they mess up, God said, okay, you're out. And now the Babylonians are the owners, and then the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans, etc., etc. Okay? You're not so special. God chose you, but as long as you behave in a certain way. When you start behaving like the previous tenants, you will end up like the previous tenants out on the street. And this is really important. It's something that we don't like to talk about because now Bible has so much, it's mixed so much with politics, but God made it very clear to Abraham as well as to the next generations. And the way to establish this covenant between God and Abraham and his progeny, his descendants, is through the act of circumcision. Circumcision, when we use the Hebrew words, we call it bris, right? Bris or brit in Hebrew is not circumcision, brit is covenant. This is a covenant that is done through the act of circumcision. I mention it here because this is another thing that the Bible and Judaism did very well. It took a practice that was very common. Almost all the nations were practicing circumcision. The only one we know who didn't were the Philistines, and that's why they are described very often as the uncircumcised. But even the biggest enemy of Israel were circumcised, only that there were a few very important differences. Circumcision outside of Israel was done during puberty, not when a boy is 8 days old. Okay, so it has some. So the focus was either fertility but here it's a sign of the covenant. So what the Bible, it's one of many, many examples of how the Bible takes a common practice and makes it Jewish, changes few key things and gives it a completely different meaning. Okay, so if you hear that everyone else practice circumcision, it's absolutely true, but nobody did it as a sign of a covenant, and nobody did it for an infant. They did it when the kids were older, and this is, by the way, still the practice in Islam, that circumcision is also an obligatory act in Islam, but they don't do it at birth. They do it when the child is much older. Okay, which used to be the practice. I want to go to the probably the most dramatic story in the Bible. So God promised Abraham children. Lot is not an option, the nephew. The servant Eliezer is not an option. Finally had Ishmael. God said, out with his mother. Abraham is 100, finally has Isaac, right? And Isaac is the son of Abraham and Sarah, exactly according to God's promise. And let's go to the text now. Share screen. Can you all see everything is fine? Some time later, God tests Abraham. Now he's Abraham, he's no longer Abram. He said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am, he replied, and God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. You see the drama, if you don't know how the story continues. Finally had a baby at 100, and then immediately after, God says, okay, very nice, good baby, kill it. And it doesn't really make sense. We don't know why God did it, and we don't know what Abraham is going to do. Before we continue, I just want to mention an event that just happened a little bit before. God came to Abraham and told him that he was going to destroy the evil cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And why? Because the people were evil. Okay? I'll just say it without talking too much. Not because they were homosexuals. That came much later. It's not in our Bible at all. Okay, so the whole concept of sodomy, it's not part of the story. Just like God destroyed the people during the time of Noah, right? Because they were corrupt, because they were evil, because of all the violence. That was the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, just something important to mention here. So God went to Abraham and said, you know, these people are bad, I'm going to kill them all. What was Abraham's reaction? But God, you're the judge of the whole earth, you cannot do it. Maybe there are 50 righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah. Would you kill the righteous on the account of the evil people? And God said, you know, you make a good point, but there aren't 50 people, righteous people in the city. And Abraham said, God, I'm sorry that I'm pushing, but maybe there are 45. God said, you know, Abraham, I wouldn't have destroyed the cities for 45 people, but no 45. And Abraham goes to 40, 30, 20, 10. And Abraham said, God, and again, each time he apologizes, and he said, God, maybe there are 10 righteous people in this. Wouldn't you save the cities on the account of the good people? And God said, I would have, but nobody's good. They're all evil and I'm going to destroy them. And Abraham didn't have an argument, but Abraham's Lot, remember the nephew Lot, remember this guy? In the meanwhile, ended up in Sodom and Gomorrah. So God said to him, but don't worry, I'm going to save your nephew Lot. And this is a very important, I mean, everything I say is very important. So take the very out, just important. There is a concept of merit of the righteous. In other words, Lot was not really such a good guy, but because he was related to Abraham, God saved him. Okay, so we sometimes have merit, not because of our doing, but because we are related to someone else. So our merit comes from our relations to others, not from who we are. And I'll just give you a little hint, and it's a good explanation. Each time we have a service, we have we call the Amida, or the Tefillah, and we start with Baruch Adonai, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, right? So when we ask God things, we said, God, it's not so much that we are good and we have the merit by which you should treat us well, but give us the merit of the righteous. Treat us well because of who our ancestors used to be. Okay, so this is one of the examples, or probably the first example, and the prototype to this concept that by affiliation, by association, you get merit and you are on God's good side. So let's look at this. Let's continue with the story. So I mentioned, so Abraham struggled with God, argued with God to save Sodom and Gomorrah, and here God tells him, kill your son. What is Abraham going to do? Okay, so verse 2, take your son and kill him. Verse 3, early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him. Not even a pip, not a word, nothing. No arguments, No, God, are you serious? Please, God, you just gave me a son. How immoral it is to kill children, nothing. And I think that there is important to show it. Verse 3 begins early in the morning. He wasted no time. Okay, got up really early in the morning and started to load his donkey with the wood and everything he needed. Verse 4, on the third day, this story, and which is the style of the Bible is extremely economical when it comes to words and description. Every word is crucial. Every word is well thought of and chosen for a purpose. Okay, they want us to read and ask all these questions on the third day. And the Torah wants us to think, so for 3 days they've been walking. Abraham, Isaac, some servants, a donkey, wood for sacrifice. Did Isaac start to figure out what was happening? Would Abraham look at his son for all this time and say, wow, I'm going to kill him? Did Abraham really mean to kill him? Was Abraham testing God, or God was testing Abraham? Child sacrifice is something that is criticized in the Bible, but we do have many stories that illustrates that yes, people or some groups in ancient Israel practiced child sacrifice. It was quite common. So at that story, when the story was told, was child sacrifice a practice, a common practice, or maybe this story is a polemics, it's criticism of child sacrifice. So we are asking all these questions we don't really understand, we don't have answers, and that's exactly what the text wants us to do, to keep struggling. Okay, so on the third day, 3 days they've been walking. Another question, Isaac, how old was he? Was he a little child? Or if you do really the math, you may figure out that he was 40 or 39. Okay, what was he walking willfully with his father, or was Abraham, or did Abraham have to put to restrain him, to put pressure on him to do that? Okay, so on the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." The word worship today means praying, right? Word worship back then meant sacrificing. Okay, that was the form of worship, definitely until the destruction of the temple. It's not that people did not pray, people did have their personal prayers, but when you wanted to commune with God, when you wanted to worship, you would sacrifice. Okay, so that was when Abraham says to worship, there was only one thing that was missing. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, which makes it even crueler. How can you take a very cruel story and make it much worse? Tells Isaac, you slept the heavy wood that I'm going to use to kill you. Okay, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carrying the fire and the knife, and the two of them went on together. Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Was it the first time that Isaac figured it out, or he knew all along? Is he going to argue, to fight? Is he going to run away? Is Abraham going to change his mind? Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And in Hebrew, you can read it also. God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, which is my son. You understand what I'm saying? There are two ways to read it. So here there is a comma, my son, or it can be the burnt offering, comma, my son. Okay? So news for you, you are the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. Okay? What do you think? Did Isaac understand it? We really don't know. It's so fascinating. And all of a sudden we think, okay, this is really the last chance for God to fulfill God's promise to Abraham, and God is going to ruin it again? What's going to happen to the promise? Was God serious? Is God reliable? Or God just likes to throw promises around without any real intention to keep them? Abram, and then we read when they reached the place God had told him about, Abram built an altar there and rang the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abram, Abram. Again, he said, here I am. Said, do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Did Abraham pass the test? Some would say Abraham failed the test. Maybe God wanted Abraham to argue and to say, God, that's not what we do. Maybe we use the word trial, which in English as well as in Hebrew can mean two different things. One is a test, but it's also a punishment. Was God just testing him, or God is giving him a very serious message for what Abraham did before? What was the act that Abraham committed before? Throughout his son Ishmael. So God said, you got rid of one son. I want to teach you a lesson of how painful it is to lose a child, how painful it is for the child, which of course nobody was thinking about Isaac here in this case. Okay, I took more time reading this story, and this is considered to be probably the most interpreted story ever. It's so dramatic, it's so beautiful. It sends us to so many directions, okay? But this is the beauty of these biblical stories. It's not about did it happen in real time or real life or not. That's really not the case. The Torah is creating this drama, this constant tension, and forces us to think. I will end here today, and next week we will finish the book of Genesis. It's time. Sounds good? Any comment or anything? Okay, so thank you for joining me. Tomorrow night, if you join us for services, either in person or on Zoom, we will celebrate the Festival of Tu Bishvat. For the kids in preschool, we call it the birthday of the trees. This is the nature holiday. The actual date is today. And one thing you can tell about Tu Bishvat, when Tu Bishvat is celebrated, the moon is full. If you like the moon, just look up and see a beautiful full moon. And we'll have an interesting service tomorrow if you are curious about it or if you want to celebrate it. Have a great night, and we will meet next week.
Thank you. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.